You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, panelists, excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. It's really my honor and pleasure to participate in these interactive hearings. And I think if I heard Carl Wright correct earlier, it's about this time in the day's sessions, the next to last speaker, when somebody might in fact be tempted to say, here is my address. But I don't intend to do that because I think my remarks will actually echo and build on what a number of people have said today. I've just returned from Incheon, Korea, where I participated in the NGO and World Education Forums. These forums affirmed that education is a fundamental human right and is at the heart of the post-2015 agenda, facilitating achievement of all other sustainable development goals. As noted by others here in this room today, success in achieving the SDGs will depend in large part on the extent to which all sectors of our societies and global community become partners and engaged in the implementation. This entails a strong emphasis on engagement, accountability, monitoring, and review, which must be embedded in national, regional, and global processes and provide formal space for participation of relevant stakeholders, and particularly the civil society and teachers' unions. We feel that the following four aspects are critical for implementation. One, financing, as we've all noted, is important, is key. And in fact, financing the full education agenda is feasible right now and within the reach of countries, whether it's ODA, whether it's domestic financing. And for example, the funds needed to educate every man, woman, and child today amounts to the net worth of the world's two richest individuals, or the annual earnings of the world's 25 richest individuals, or the net profit of the world's 5 richest companies, or less than $1.20 that the world lost to tax evasion in 2012, a total of $3.1 trillion through tax loopholes and tax havens. And I appreciate the comments from my colleague from Indonesia in this regard. What is needed is the political will. The discussion on raising additional revenue must also include discussions on expenditures to ensure that revenues generated address the needs of the world's poor. Global benchmarks for education financing, 4 to 6% of GDP, or 15 to 20% of the national budget, have been internationally recognized, tracked for decades, and reiterated in the Incheon WEF Declaration on Education this past week. 2, there needs to be a strong focus ensuring thematic and non-financial MOIs, especially in the early years of implementation. Inputs are needed to get outputs. The availability of trained and supported teachers in safe and inclusive classroom environments are critical for ensuring universal, quality education and lifeline learning for all. 3, strengthen state systems to ensure education delivery and ensure that private sector participation does not lower state accountability. We must be vigilant to ensure that governments remain committed to providing education as a public good and not default to the privatization of education. Kishore Singh, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, points out, quote, "The cost of privatizing education lies not just with school fees, but also with the damage done to the public good. Fees, however small, hit the poorest and most vulnerable hardest. Sometimes this means the oldest son receives an education while daughters stay at home. Inequalities in society grow when the poorest are excluded," unquote. The role of the private sector in education is important, key, but must be complementary, as so many of you have said here today. It must not be a source of segregation, discrimination, and inequalities based on user fees. 4, robust disaggregated data is necessary for monitoring implementation. There must be an inclusive process of setting quantifiable indicators, benchmarks, and building common understanding of terms and formal space for participation of civil society in the development of indicators. Indicators selected must not dilute the framework and must adhere to existing human rights commitments. Building data collection and statistical capacities of education and other concerned ministries is critical. We also feel that strengthening the partnerships must entail the following 5 aspects. 1, strengthening partnership at the grassroots and subnational level, as others have mentioned here today too. Processes need to be put in place to ensure that national and community level stakeholders, including teachers, parents, Government, civil servants, and civil society and youth, as my colleague from the Hunger Project pointed out, can contribute their experiences and efforts toward implementation. Technology can be used to track progress in an online and transparent mechanism, perhaps along the lines of the online knowledge bank that was made reference earlier. 2, stakeholders in each country need to learn with and from each other to facilitate cross-border sharing, particularly on a South-South basis. It will be important to create diverse, technology-assisted, transparent, and accessible mechanisms to share successful and non-successful strategies and practices locally, nationally, and globally. 3, strengthen and extend the existing mechanisms of civil society participation through the engagement with all other stakeholders as we move from developing to actually implementing the new agenda. 4, strengthen existing thematic partnerships. Globally and regionally, we must build on the existing robust thematic partnerships, for example, built around the Education for All Steering Committee and mechanisms of global review on education through such as the Global Education Monitoring Report. The WEF in Korea brought together the international education community, including over 100 education ministers who have drafted a framework for action to implement the education SDG. This must be the basis for follow-up and review mechanisms for the education SDG. And any process of thematic review globally must not weaken existing mechanisms. In conclusion, number 5, we in the education civil society community are also committed to working actively and constructively toward achieving the visionary and transformational education SDG. Civil society is committed to sharing broadly the WF Declaration and Framework for Action to ensure that stakeholder engagement is as wide as possible. With regional and national coalitions of NGOs in 100 countries, for example, the Global Campaign for Education is committed to work and cooperate with governments and others to reach our common goal to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for a quality education for all, thereby creating peaceful and just societies. Thank you.